It began, as so many things in Oxford do, with the weather pretending to be something it wasn't. The sky had that silvery calm that suggested the promise of light, but there was no real sun behind it, only the patience of drizzle waiting its turn. I had been standing by the window in my flat on North Parade, the glass clouded faintly from the kettle's breath, when I saw him. A young man, not remarkable in appearance, yet curiously deliberate in motion, standing under the chestnut tree opposite, as if listening to it. He did not move for several minutes. When he finally turned, his gaze caught mine. Not in greeting, more as one might glance toward a sound that hadn't yet occurred. There are instances, even in the smallest hours of one's days, that seem to contain a pattern and outline you feel before you see. That morning was such an instant. By evening his name would be written on a police report, and by the following week I would be told I had misjudged him entirely. At the station Lewis was reading the Mail. He folded it without looking up when I entered, remarking that the university gardener had found a body near the chapel steps at Keble. Nothing dramatic, this tone was almost tender, as if the dead had chosen a tasteful address. He said they thought it was an accident. I said nothing, and that silence, I think, was enough to make him sigh. We drove there together, the city wrapped in that faint drizzle I had half expected. Keble's bricks glistened like drying blood, and the quads smelled of wet soil and leaf mould. A small crowd had gathered, fellows in gowns, a porter whispering, two constables pretending not to shiver. The body was laid out by the railings, face turned slightly away, as if resisting interruption. Someone murmured that the young man's name was Thomas Vale, a postgraduate in theology, 28, known for his essays on moral silence in early Christian writings. A subject, I mused, that suddenly felt uncomfortably literal. Lewis waited until I crouched beside the corpse before speaking. He asked if I wanted to see the note found in Vale's pocket. I did not answer immediately. The right hand was extended a little from the body, palm open, as though offering or receiving something. I remember noticing the soil beneath his fingernails, the faint abrasion on the wrist that didn't fit with a fall. His neck was unmarked, yet the expression somewhere between surrender and astonishment told a story quieter than violence, but older than despair. Lewis handed me the paper, a single line written in pencil. All that remains is the echo of stillness. He said it sounded like a suicide note. I said it sounded like a quotation, perhaps Kierkegaard, or someone cleverer. He shrugged. We walked back across the quad, the paving stones slick with rain. I asked if there had been a pen found nearby. He said no, only the note. Strange, I murmured. A theologian quoting silence, but using pencil on cheap paper. One doesn't expect theology to smudge so easily. Later, when the coroner arrived, I lingered near the chapel entrance. Inside, the choir was rehearsing boys' voices rising and falling like small, bright birds against the damp air. I watched their conductor lift his hand, hold it aloft a moment longer than necessary, then let it fall. The sound ceased, but not before the last echo dissolved into the stone. I thought again of Vale's phrase, the echo of stillness. Back in my flat that evening, I found myself staring at the crossword I had left half-finished that morning. The clue that had stopped me was 14 down quiet remains, perhaps 7. I had written ash before realizing the count was wrong. The correct answer, when it came to me, was still. The next day, Lewis would tell me the post-mortem suggested drowning. Odd, given that there was no water near Keble's chapel, unless one counted the slow tears of Oxford rain. And somewhere in the back of my mind I would begin to wonder if stillness could, in certain lights, resemble an argument. There are days when the city's silence seems almost theatrical, as though Oxford itself were performing grief. The morning after Thomas Vale's death, the rain had retreated, leaving the pavements burnished with an uncertain light. I remember the way my shoes echoed against the flagstones as I crossed the quadrangle of Keble again, feeling that peculiar detachment that comes when death has been tidied away. The body was gone, of course. What remained was the absence of curiosity among those who ought to have known him best. Lewis was waiting in the porter's lodge, holding 2 cups of something that smelled faintly of cardboard and hope. He told me the college authorities were keen for the investigation to conclude quickly. Students were impressionable, he said. Suicides spread like colds. I asked if the coroner's report had arrived. It had not. He looked uneasy when I asked about the abrasions on Vale's wrist. Probably from a fall, he said. Probably. I asked to see Vale's rooms. The porter led us through a stairwell that smelled of polish and damp tweed. On the 2nd floor the door stood ajar, the lock marked with chalk. Inside the air was heavy with disuse, as though the occupant had been absent for months rather than hours. A narrow bed, neatly made, a desk beneath the window, books everywhere, arranged without affection, theology, philosophy, fragments of poetry, and on the sill a single half-burned candle in a chipped saucer. Lewis said something about loneliness. I said nothing. Loneliness was not a clue, it was a contagion. I moved to the desk and examined the papers. Most were drafts of an essay titled The Ethics of Withdrawal. Vale's handwriting was measured, though it faltered in places, sentences trailing into pale, uncertain lines. One page ended abruptly with the words, "To listen for silence is to risk hearing oneself." The next was blank, a line interrupted. There was a pencil lying diagonally across the paper. I lifted it and found a faint indentation beneath the blank sheet, the ghost of writing pressed through. I shaded lightly with the side of the lead. The words emerged slowly, incomplete. "All that remains is, and then nothing." I told Lewis to fetch the note we'd found on the body. He frowned, but obeyed. When he returned, I laid the recovered words beside the original paper. The hand was the same, but the pressure was different. One written with deliberation, the other under strain. Vale's supposed farewell, it seemed, had been rehearsed. Outside, a clock struck 10, its chime wandering through the corridor like an afterthought. I noticed then a small square of paper pinned above the desk, a crossword grid half filled. My eyes drifted to the clue 17 across parting words, perhaps 7. Vale had written goodbye, then crossed it out. Below it, faintly, the attempt at another silence. That one he had left unfinished. Lewis was looking at me in that way he does when he suspects my thoughts have left the room. He asked what I was thinking. I said that perhaps the man had not been alone when he wrote the final version. He asked what made me think that. I told him the candle was burned only halfway, but the wax had hardened on one side, as if the flame had leaned toward movement. Someone had walked past him while he wrote. He said it could have been the draught from the window. I said perhaps, but the window latch was stiff with dust. When we left the room, I paused on the landing, the faintest mark barely visible along the skirting board near the door. A thin grey line, as if a small case or bag had been dragged hurriedly away. Vale's possessions, Lewis reminded me, were few, no family nearby, no visitors recorded, and yet the scratch was fresh. That evening I went alone to the Turf Tavern. The bar was half empty, the air thick with the smell of hops and forgotten laughter. I sat with a whisky and tried to recall the look in Vale's eyes from that morning beneath the chestnut tree. There had been no fear in them, only a tension, as if he'd been waiting for a signal that never arrived. In the crossword of the mind, I thought, some clues are written in silence, and the answers, if they come at all, tend to arrive when one has stopped searching. It was in the late afternoon that I began to feel the city tightening around the way Oxford does when the light begins to fail, and even the gargoyles appear to be listening. I had spent most of the day waiting for a laboratory report that refused to arrive. Paperwork, they said, as though truth was something one could misplace among forms and signatures. Lewis thought I was wasting my time. He had gone to see the bursar at Keble, hoping for gossip disguised as administrative insight. I stayed at my desk tracing circles on the map of the college, the chapel, the quadrangle, Vale's staircase. They made a small, self-contained geometry, a pattern that seemed to resist intrusion. I began to suspect that what had happened was not murder in the usual sense, but an idea carried too far. When the report did come, it was brief. No water in the lungs, only traces of alcohol and a mild sedative. Drowning, then, was merely the coroner's metaphor. Vale had been dead before he reached the ground. The notion of suicide was now as fragile as the paper it had been written on. I found myself walking toward Keble without intention. The autumn air had turned colder, and the lamps along Parks Road flickered with the indecision of early dusk. By the time I reached the chapel, the choir had begun their evensong. Their voices moved through the air like small flames, wavering but refusing to go out. I stood in the shadows, listening. There was a student I had noticed before, a thin girl with dark hair tied too tightly, sitting apart from the others. Her hands clasped around a hymn book she never opened. When the final verse ended, she remained seated. I asked if she had known Vale. She hesitated, then said he used to visit the library late at night. Always returned the same book, a treatise on the nature of grace. He said he liked the margins more than the text. I asked what he meant. She smiled faintly. He wrote in them, she said. Little notes, half sentences, sometimes in Latin. I asked if she still had the book. She said it was due back tomorrow. The library was almost empty when I entered. The air smelled of dust, of bindings long forgotten by human touch. I found the treatise easily enough shelved, as such things are, between volumes no one reads, but no one dares discard. Inside the front cover was a borrowing slip by Thomas Vale, signed 3 times in the past month. I turned the pages slowly. Near the end, in the margin beside a passage on divine silence, a phrase appeared in Vale's careful hand. Proof deferred. Is faith betrayed? Lewis would later tell me it was a quotation from Pascal. I wasn't so sure. The handwriting told me more than the words. It trembled slightly, as though copied under pressure. The ink had bled into the paper in a way that suggested haste or fear. When I closed the book, I noticed something caught between the final pages. A ticket stub from a recital at the Sheldonian Theatre 2 nights before his death. The name of the performer was smudged, but the seat number B12 was clear enough. I slipped it into my pocket and wondered whether Vale had been listening to music or waiting for someone to join him in silence. Outside, the evening had settled into its usual ambiguity. The bells from St. Giles carried across the roofs, fading like promises. I thought of the phrase again, proof deferred, and realized that perhaps all our lives were built upon postponements of understanding. The evidence is always there, just not when one most wishes to find it. As I walked home along the wet pavements, I caught my reflection in a darkened shop window and barely recognized it. There are moments when a detective becomes the last witness of his own certainties. I wondered, not for the first time, whether the pursuit of truth is merely another form of delayed way of keeping company with ghosts. It was Lewis who suggested we pay a visit to the Dean. The title alone seemed to carry the weight of age, as though wisdom had been conferred not by intellect, but by endurance. Keble's Dean, Dr. Edmund Selwyn, was a man known for his sermons on restraint and his rumoured fondness for sherry. I was not sure which trait would prove more useful. We met him in his study, a narrow, book-cluttered room that smelled of dust and a faint hint of pipe smoke, though no pipe was visible. Rain tapped softly at the stained glass window, like an audience uncertain when to applaud. Selwyn looked older than his years, his thin hands folded in an almost devotional poise, yet his eyes held that mild impatience peculiar to men accustomed to being listened to. Lewis asked the formal questions first, Vale's attendance record, his character, his friends. The Dean's answers were too polished, rehearsed to the point of abstraction. A brilliant scholar, but withdrawn, troubled perhaps, the sort who, if left alone, would take his solitude as permission to vanish. I said little, preferring to watch the small gestures that language tends to conceal, the tapping of one finger against another, the occasional glance toward a locked drawer behind the desk. When I asked about the essay Vale had been working on, The Ethics of Withdrawal, Selwyn's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He said he had not read it, that the boy was under the supervision of another fellow. The denial came too quickly. I asked which fellow. He hesitated, then offered a name I knew, Dr. Patrick Corwin, a theologian of the modern sort who quoted Kierkegaard with a sense of irony. Lewis, missing the subtle turn in the Dean's tone, asked if Vale and Corwin had been close. The question hung in the air, longer than it should have. Finally, Selwyn murmured that intellectual intimacy is a difficult thing to measure. I said that spiritual intimacy was more difficult still. He looked at me then, properly for the first time. The kind of look that arrives a fraction too late to be innocent. When we left the study, Lewis remarked that the Dean seemed harmless enough. I said harm often prefers the appearance of gentility. We walked through the cloisters in silence. Somewhere a bell tolled for chapel, its sound bending in the damp air. I thought of Vale's unfinished line, the proof deferred, and of the Dean's quick dismissal of Corwin's name. There was something in that exchange tension half hidden, like a musical phrase played in a minor key. We found Corwin later that afternoon, in the senior common room, his back to us, reading The Times. He greeted us with the kind of charm that dissolves suspicion before it can take root. Lewis liked him immediately. I did not. Corwin spoke of Vale in the past tense with too much composure. Said the young man was gifted but intense, prone to abstraction, obsessed with questions no answer could satisfy. When I asked if Vale had confided in him, he smiled slightly. He said the boy often mistook theology for confession. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added that Vale had been deeply troubled by a certain moral paradox. He did not elaborate. Before leaving, I noticed a crossword folded on the table beside Corwin's cup of tea. The top corner bore a faint pencil mark. The clue 9 down read, Circle of Influence. 5. The answer he had filled was Deans. I wondered if that was wit or warning. That night I returned to my flat, uneasy. I poured a whisky and sat by the window, watching the lights of Oxford tremble through the mist. The word circle would not leave me. A dean, a fellow, a student. 3 points, forming something enclosed, something self-sustaining. Lewis had said earlier that we were looking for a motive. I thought perhaps we were looking for permission, the quiet consent that allows one soul to destroy another while calling it faith. Outside the rain began again, soft and relentless. Somewhere a church bell faltered mid-ring, as though unsure of its purpose. I listened until the sound faded into the dark and thought how often faith ends, not in revelation, but in silence that feels almost rehearsed. There are patterns that reveal themselves only when one stops looking. That evening, I found myself back at the station, half listening to the low hum of conversation and the mechanical sigh of the kettle, Lewis was filling out a report with the diligence of a man who still believed bureaucracy could explain the world. I envied him for that faith. The file on Thomas Vale lay open before me, a small mountain of paper pretending to be the truth. Among the items recovered from his room, a notebook had gone unnoticed until that afternoon. The cover was black, the edges damp from rain, its pages filled with a peculiar mixture of theology and mathematics. Not equations exactly, but a kind of philosophical arithmetic lines connecting moral concepts to symbols, as if the writer had been trying to quantify belief. One fragment caught my attention: faith, silence, doubt. A strange symmetry, precise yet hollow. The ink had faded unevenly, as though the thought itself had refused permanence. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, squinting at the page. He said it looked like the sort of nonsense clever people write when they're unhappy. I told him unhappiness rarely bothers with symbols. It prefers plain language and empty glasses. He grinned, not sure whether it was a joke. I turned the page and found a small equation scrawled in the margin, almost as an afterthought: 110. Below it, a line where 2 become 1, nothing remains. It struck me with the same unease I'd felt reading Vale's essays, a logic constructed to explain an absence. That night I walked back through the misted streets, the lamps shimmering like coins tossed into water. At Keble, the chapel door was unlocked. I stepped inside. The air was heavy with the smell of old incense and candle wax. The stained glass caught the faintest trace of light from outside, painting the floor in uncertain reds and blues. I sat for a while in one of the rear pews, listening to the ticking of the heating pipes. There was movement near the altar. Dr. Corwin emerged from the shadows, his gown unbuttoned, his expression unreadable. He said he often came here at night. It was the only place where the silence didn't accuse him. I asked whether Vale had come here too. Sometimes, he said. Then after a pause he added that the young man had been brilliant but fragile, too aware of the space between faith and comprehension. He gestured toward the lectern where a Bible lay open. He said Vale had left it there the week before his death. On the page, a passage from Ecclesiastes that is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. Corwin said he had taken it as a confession. I said it sounded more like a proof. When I returned to my flat later, I spread Vale's notebook across the table beside my half-finished crossword. The clue I'd been avoiding all week stared back at me. Moral equation without solution 8. I filled in the word paradox. Only then did I notice that the number 8, if turned on its side, resembled the symbol for infinitely a loop without end or beginning. Somewhere between the algebra of faith and the arithmetic of guilt, I began to see the shape of the thing Vale had been wrestling with. His equations were not meant to solve anything. They were confessions written in the language of numbers, a dialogue between belief and logic, where every answer cancelled itself out. Perhaps he had found the silence he was searching for by proving that none of it added up. The whiskey helped dull the edges of that thought, but not erase it. The city outside was quiet, save for the distant chime of Magdalen's clock. I thought of the Dean's careful evasions, of Corwin's charm, of the candle wax hardened on one side. Somewhere among these gestures lay a line connecting 2 points, a sum Vale had begun but never finished. Before turning in, I wrote a note in the margin of my own crossword, an echo of his obsession 110. A feeble protest, perhaps, but it felt necessary, for if 2 minds had truly joined in that final, desperate act, then somewhere, even in the silence, something must still remain. It was near dusk when I saw her standing by the iron gates of Keble, half silhouetted against the last dull flame of the sky. I had been walking back from the Bodleian, my thoughts circling the same unsolved geometry of Vale's death, when the figure appeared. She did not move as I approached, only lifted her face slightly, as though listening to a memory instead of a sound. Her name, she said, was Alice Vale. Sister? I hadn't known he had one. She spoke quietly as if each word had to pass through something heavy before it reached the air. The college had not contacted her. She had read about her brother's death in the papers. They had written that word again, suicide, and she asked if it was true. I told her the truth was a slow visitor in Oxford. She looked at me then with the unflinching composure of the recently bereaved. She said her brother had been afraid of something, not death, exactly, but of what he might reveal before it came. I asked what she meant. She said he had written to her 2 weeks before, a letter so full of erasures it seemed he was arguing with himself. She handed it to me. The envelope smelled faintly of rain and cedar, inside a single sheet of paper, torn at the edge. The letter began without greeting. If proof must come, let it be through silence. Then a few scattered lines about conscience, about someone whose approval had meant too much. The last sentence was incomplete. He said that faith was, and then the ink stopped, as though the hand had trembled or the writer had changed his mind. I folded it carefully. She asked if I thought her brother had been murdered. I told her I thought he had been persuaded. She asked if that was different. I said persuasion leaves fewer fingerprints. Rain began to fall then, slow and deliberate. We stood together beneath the archway while the gates clicked faintly in the wind. She said her brother had been devoted to a man at the college, a mentor of sorts. She would not give the name, but she said Thomas had once written of him as the one who teaches that silence is the truest form of love. I needed no more than that to know who she meant. When she left, I remained for a while by the gate. The porter's lamp flickered behind the glass, catching the raindrops on the railings. I thought of Corwin's confident calm, of Selwyn's immaculate evasions. The equation of the dead man's faith was beginning to balance itself, though the sum it produced was bleak. Later that night, Lewis came by the flat with the results of the handwriting comparison. Vale's note, the one found on his body, had been traced, not written. A faint carbon impression beneath it suggested it had been copied from another sheet. I poured him a whiskey. He asked what it meant. I told him it meant someone had rehearsed the boy's silence for him. Lewis muttered something about coincidence. I said coincidence was simply the alibi of the unimaginative. He said I was getting morbid. I told him Oxford had that effect. After he left, I read the letter again. The unfinished line faith reminds me of a phrase from Corwin's last lecture, which I had attended months earlier. He had spoken of belief as an act of annihilation, of the need to surrender intellect for grace. The students had listened as though to music. I remember thinking then that such words, if spoken to someone fragile enough, could sound like permission. Outside, the rain had settled into a whisper. I drew the curtains, leaving only the lamplight over the table. The crossword from the morning still lay there, untouched. The clue I filled in without thinking, 7 down confession disguised as reason 5. The answer came easily logic. It struck me, not for the first time, that we spend our lives constructing meanings just plausible enough to live with. Vale had done the same, and somewhere between his proof and his silence, a single line had been crossed, almost tenderly, into the territory where logic ceases to comfort. The truth, I've found, rarely enters through the front door. It slips instead through the side gate, disguised as something else, music, perhaps, or memory. That evening, it came through both. Lewis had convinced me to attend the recital at the Sheldonian. It was the same performance Vale's ticket had marked 2 nights before he died. The orchestra was playing Bach's St. Matthew Passion, a choice so severe in its beauty that I almost resented it. Lewis said he thought we might hear what Vale heard. I told him sound seldom behaves like evidence, but I went anyway. The hall was full of the usual mixture: students in black, dons whispering theology into each other's collars, tourists pretending reverence. I took my seat at the back. When the first chords began, I felt that strange stillness only great music can provoke, the sense that someone, somewhere, is measuring the listener's soul. I tried to imagine Vale sitting there in seat B12, his notebook in his coat pocket, his thoughts perhaps already leaning toward silence. But when the soprano entered, clear, aching, impossible, I saw something else. Not resignation, recognition. Lewis leaned closer, muttering that Corwin had been among the audience that night. He'd checked the college records. The Music Society had listed him as patron. I watched the conductor's baton carve the air like a metronome for confession, and thought of that line in Vale's essay, "To listen for silence is to risk hearing oneself." After the interval, I left Lewis to his program and walked the perimeter of the hall. Near the side exit, a woman was speaking to one of the ushers. It was Alice Vale. She told me she came every year, not for her brother, but for herself. He had taken her here once and said that harmony was the only argument worth losing. She asked if I believed that. I said I used to. She smiled the way people do when they recognize an echo. When the performance ended, I found Corwin near the stage, congratulating the conductor. He was all grace and warmth, but his eyes flicked toward me with that familiar apprehension. I mentioned the ticket stub found in Vale's book. He said he remembered seeing the boy there, alone. Said he'd looked moved, almost exultant. I asked if he'd spoken to him afterward. He paused, too briefly to be unnoticed, then said no, that he had left early. It wasn't true. I had already confirmed with the usher that Corwin had stayed until the final encore. I said nothing then, only thanked him and walked away. Later in my flat, I played a recording of the same piece on the old turntable. The music filled the room unevenly, as though the walls resisted it. Halfway through, I noticed something I'd never registered before: a faint dissonance in the choral line, a single note just out of tune. The error was subtle but deliberate. It drew attention to the harmony by momentarily fracturing it. And then it came to me, Vale's equations, his phrase 110. It wasn't theology, it was music. 2 voices becoming one until their distinction vanished, counterpoint collapsing into pure tone. What he called silence was not death, but absorption. If Corwin had told him that love required surrender of self, it would have sounded almost divine and fatal. Lewis arrived soon after, bringing with him a file of phone records. Corwin had called Vale the night before the death, a 5-minute conversation, no witness, no record of content. I said that sometimes what's not said can be louder than speech. He asked if I thought the man was guilty. I said of what? I wasn't yet sure, perhaps of truth, rendered too beautifully. After he left, I poured myself a drink and watched the whiskey catch the lamplight like amber glass. The record had reached the final aria, the one where the voice rises, breaks, and vanishes into the orchestra. The harmonic lie, I thought, is that 2 notes sounding together create unity. They don't. They create tension brief, exquisite, and unsustainable. When it resolves, one voice must yield to the other. Vale had believed he could stay in the tension forever. Corwin, I suspected, had let him believe it. Outside, the wind pressed against the window pane like someone trying to enter. I lifted the needle, and the silence that followed was so complete it almost sounded like the truth. There is a particular hour in Oxford, somewhere between dusk and the first bell of evening prayer, when even the air seems to hesitate. That was the hour in which the case began to turn quietly, imperceptibly, like a note held too long in the wrong key. Lewis and I had returned to Keble once more, though neither of us could quite justify why. Habit, perhaps, or the unspoken belief that a place retains what it has witnessed. The college was unusually still, its windows reflecting the pale tremor of the lamps along Parks Road. Somewhere a piano was playing not well, but earnestly. A slow prelude in C minor, hesitant at the edges. I followed the sound without a word to Lewis. It came from the chapel. Inside the light was thin, filtered through glass like a thought half-remembered. At the piano sat Dr. Corwin. His back was straight, his hands deliberate, his expression too calm to be natural. I watched for a while before he noticed me. When he did, he let the final chord linger, the harmony dissolving into silence. He said he came there to think. I said thinking had become dangerous of late. He smiled, a careful arrangement of muscle and intention, and asked whether I believed in coincidence. I told him I preferred structure. He laughed softly and said the structure was merely a coincidence written in notation. Lewis entered then, breaking whatever rhythm had been forming. He said the forensic report had arrived. There were traces of phenobarbital in Vale's blood, but not enough to kill him enough, though, to quiet resistance. The source was still unknown. Corwin's eyes flickered toward the communion table for the briefest second, and I caught the movement like a wrong note in a familiar melody. We left him soon after. In the quadrangle, I asked Lewis to look into the college's medical supplies, particularly any controlled substances used by the choir for performance nerves. He said I was stretching things. I said that music had killed before, though not always in the way people imagined. Back in my flat, I opened Vale's notebook again. I'd been through it so many times the pages had begun to feel memorized, yet something tugged at me, a line I'd read, but not heard properly. When the voice falters, the meaning begins. I dismissed it as poetic once. Now it felt deliberate. The next morning, I asked the choir director to show me the scores Vale had helped annotate. Among the sheets of Bach and Tallis, one stood out, Agnus Dei, marked with Vale's handwriting. But the alterations were strange phrases crossed out, notes shifted slightly, as though he were rewriting the harmony to conceal something. Near the final bar, he had penciled a small equation, 314. It meant nothing to anyone else. To me, it was a rhythm measure. That evening, I returned to the chapel alone. I sat at the piano and played the section marked 3 to 14. The chords were uneven, unstable. Between two of them, between F minor and G major, there was a pause, so subtle it felt like breath withheld. When I pressed those keys together, a dissonance emerged, quiet but unmistakable, a harmonic lie. Vale had been rewriting the music to reveal it, a corruption in the sound itself, like truth hidden in harmony. Someone had changed the score after him, erasing the evidence. Corwin, perhaps, or someone under his direction. The notion was absurd, and yet the air seemed to vibrate with it. When I rose to leave, I saw something glinting beneath the piano, a small glass vial, half full, labelled only PC. I slipped it into my pocket and left before thought could turn to certainty. Outside, the night had gathered itself fully. The rain was falling again, soft and insistent. I walked without direction until I found myself near the river. The lights of Oxford shimmered in the current like misplaced stars. Lewis would later tell me that the vial contained a sedative consistent with what had been found in Vale's blood. He asked if I thought Corwin had administered it. I said I thought he had composed it. He frowned, not understanding. But music, I said, is just another way of telling the same life, something that begins in beauty and ends in silence. When I reached home, I poured the last of the whiskey and sat by the window. The rain made a rhythm against the glass, steady, unresolved. I thought of Vail, of the unfinished line in his letter, of the equation without solution. And for the first time, I began to understand that death, too, comes in variations, each one a repetition of the same theme, played softer with every return. It was early morning when the call came, the kind of pale, directionless hour when the city seems to be thinking rather than waking. Lewis's voice sounded tired, though that might have been my imagination. He said Corwin had been found in his rooms. Not dead, not yet. A glass beside him, a faint smell of something medicinal, and a note, if one could call it that. By the time I arrived, the sunlight had begun to filter through the curtains like the hesitant fingers of a confession. Corwin lay on the bed, breathing shallowly, his complexion the colour of parchment too long in shadow. The doctor said he'd live, though whether he wanted to was another matter. On the bedside table, the note, half a page torn from a student's essay, contained only 4 words. The proof is silence. Lewis was pacing. He asked whether I thought it was guilt. I told him guilt was never that tidy. He said then it must be fear. I said perhaps, though fear often looks too much like faith to tell them apart. The dean arrived soon after, pale and officious, his hands folded as though in perpetual prayer. He wanted to know if this would be reported to the papers. I told him, truth has a way of leaking through even the thickest stone. He didn't appreciate the remark. When they carried Corwin out, I walked to his desk. The surface was immaculate except for a single sheet of manuscript paper. The title read, Motet, for 2 voices. The first line was complete, the second abandoned mid-phrase, notes hanging like unanswered questions. I traced the rhythm with my finger. It was the same sequence Vail had written in his notebook, the same 3/14 measure. Harmony is reduced to repetition. The imitation of faith, perhaps, rather than faith itself. I asked Lewis to fetch the earlier evidence, the vial, the essay drafts, Vail's notebook. I wanted to see them together. When they were laid out side by side in the chapel later that afternoon, the pattern began to show itself, the sedative, the rewritten music, the letter with the unfinished line. They were all fragments of the same construction. Vail had not killed himself. He had been persuaded into an act of spiritual proof, guided by the same language Corwin used in his lectures. Submission, surrender, silence. Yet I could not help but feel that Corwin too had been caught in his own creation. The man had mistaken art for absolution, and his disciple had believed him. Lewis asked, what would happen now? I said that depended on how much truth the college was willing to hear. He said they would prefer none at all. I agreed. Oxford, I told him, is a place where even truth is expected to wear a tie. As evening fell, I returned to the chapel one last time. The piano was untouched, but the sheet music remained open. I sat down, not to play, but to listen to the quiet that had settled between the stones. There was something almost alive in it, as if the building were holding its breath. On the desk beside me lay a folded page from Corwin's pocket. It was a crossword, half-finished. One clue stood out 13 across, consequence of proof, 7 he had written Requiem. It fit too perfectly to be a coincidence. I left the chapel and walked through the quadrangle. The rain had begun again, steady and insistent. I thought of Vail's final line. He said that faith was, and realized perhaps that Corwin had given him the answer himself. Faith was silence. The equation had resolved exactly as written. One voice erased by another. Back in my flat, I poured the last of the whiskey and sat by the window. Lewis would file his report and the dean would polish his statements. The newspapers, if they cared, would print their usual euphemisms. Only the music would remain two voices forever striving toward harmony, never quite arriving. Before turning in, I picked up the crossword from my own desk. The clue I'd left unanswered for days stared back at me. 4 down end of the argument 5. Without hesitation, I wrote the word peace. Then after a moment's thought, I crossed it out. The truth, I've learned, rarely ends in peace. More often, it simply fades like a final chord held too long, until even its echo forgets the sound that made it. There is a silence peculiar to Oxford in winter, a silence that is not the absence of sound, but its afterlife. The city holds its breath between bells, between footsteps, between the faint rustle of pages in a library where no one truly reads anymore. It was in that kind of silence the case ended, though I did not recognize it as an ending at the time. Corwin survived. The doctors said it was a near thing, though one might argue survival was not the word for it. He would recover, they said, though his mind seemed to exist elsewhere, somewhere beyond confession or remorse. Lewis went to see him once. I did not. There are conversations that cannot be had without distorting the truth, and I feared I might want to forgive him. The dean wrote to the press, as I'd expected, calling it a tragedy of faith, a phrase polished to the point of anesthesia. Vale's name was not mentioned beyond the necessary formalities. There was talk of an academic leave for Corwin, of health, of reflection. The college would survive, as it always does, by absorbing the scandal into its architecture. I spent the following weeks adrift. The crossword offered no distraction, the whiskey no consolation. Lewis came by sometimes, trying to persuade me that I'd done what I could. He was kind enough to mean it, but the truth is that some cases don't end. They fade like chalk under rain, until all that remains is a faint memory of the line. One evening, I found myself walking without direction, the air cold enough to make thought visible. I drifted toward the river, where the water slid beneath the bridge in its usual quiet deceit. There was a figure ahead, Alice Vale, standing beneath a lamp that hummed faintly against the wind. She told me she'd come to Oxford to collect her brother's things. I said I could help. She shook her head. She asked whether I believed in redemption. I said it depended on who was offering it. She smiled then, not unkindly, and said her brother had believed that silence was the only answer worth hearing. I told her I thought silence could also be a form of cowardice. She looked toward the dark curve of the water and said perhaps the difference was only one of faith. When she left, I remained there, watching her shadow disappear along the path. The air smelled of wet stone and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, the faint chiming of a clock drifted through the mittens, maybe 11. It felt less like time passing than time pausing to listen. Later in my flat, I opened the box of Vale's belongings that she had not wanted. A few books, the broken pencil, the small black notebook with its neat, trembling lines. At the bottom lay something I hadn't seen before, a folded page torn from a hymnal. On it, a short annotation in Vale's hand. The sound of absence is not silence, but expectation. It struck me then that everything about this case had been built on expectation. Vale's belief in Corwin's wisdom, Corwin's faith in his own rhetoric, the dean's certainty that truth could be buried beneath ritual, and mine the stubborn expectation that reason might redeem what faith had undone. I closed the notebook and listened. The city was utterly still. No wind, no rain, only the hum of the radiator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Yet within that stillness, I began to hear the soft vibration of life persisting, unseen, unmeasured, the sound of everything that remains when belief has gone quiet. Before turning in, I completed the crossword I'd left unfinished for days, the final clue. 13 down what remains after faith. 7, I wrote the answer slowly, each letter deliberate. Memory. It felt right, though not complete. I poured the last inch of whiskey and raised it toward the night beyond the window. The rain began again, tapping against the glass, with the light rhythm of thought returning. Somewhere in that sound, the rain, the city, the fragile persistence of music I could no longer hear, I thought I understood what Vale had meant. Silence was never the proof. It was only the space left for those still listening.